lunch, first session, so wake up. Our session today is interpreting Minnesota's oldest roadside markers, opportunities, and challenges. At the core of this session this afternoon is a collection of historic roadside markers and monuments located in Redwood and Renville counties near the Lower Sioux Indian community at Cheyanne and the cities of Redwood Falls and Morton. The Minnesota Valley Historical Society installed these markers 125 years ago in 1898 at locations associated with the US-Dakota War of 1862. During the intervening century, these markers were largely abandoned, but all managed to survive the test of time. This one, marking the location of the home of Ta Oyate Duta, also known as Little Crow, became an isolated and easily overlooked piece of granite in the ditch of a busy highway outside Redwood Falls. The markers, though, were not entirely forgotten. When this particular marker was hit by a car, it was repaired, and there was occasional discussion among descendants and community members about removing this marker to a safer location. And that's where the next chapter for these markers begins, with a call to the Minnesota Department of Transportation to learn what could be done. The answer was not a simple one, and it would take partnerships across multiple agencies to turn initial challenges into opportunities for revitalized interpretation inclusive of Dakota language and orthography and also Dakota narratives. That is the story that we want to share with you this afternoon. And we'll begin by introducing ourselves. I'm Michelle Terrell with Two Pines Resource Group. I was the consultant on this project, assisting with historical documentation and condition assessment and evaluations of the monuments themselves, as well as interpretation planning. Do you want to come up? We'll introduce the rest of our team.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cheyanne St. John. I serve as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer at Cheyanne, also known as Lower Sioux.
I'm Teresa Martin. I'm with Tribal Affairs at MnDOT. It's in the state highway right-of-way. That's how we became looped into it. And we worked on funding and coordination on this part of the project.
So the way we've organized our session this afternoon is that each of us will give a short presentation on our role within the project and share our perspective on these monuments. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time towards the end of the session, and we'll sort of devolve into a panel discussion, and then you can each ask questions of us, and we'll discuss maybe amongst us too some of the other things we learned in the course of this project. As our first speaker, it's my role to provide the historic context and introduction to the markers themselves. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, a memorialization effort swept the nation. Even before the war was over, markers and memorials were being erected on the war's battlefields and grave sites. Among the first markers to be placed on the Gettysburg battlefield was this memorial urn to the 1st Minnesota, which was actually placed in the National Cemetery. These efforts expanded during the late 19th century to include places related to the earlier American Revolution, as well as other types of historic sites. In Minnesota, events of the US-Dakota War were among the first to be identified and commemorated with stone monuments. The earliest US-Dakota War memorials, like those on the national scale, were placed in cemeteries, the earliest being the Captain Marsh Monument in the Fort Ridgely Cemetery, which was placed in 1873. In the 1890s, though, the state began and continuing through the first part of the 20th century, the Minnesota State Legislature began funding the erection of a series of towering granite monuments on pieces of public land. Local groups also participated in this memorialization effort. In Renville and Redwood counties, the Minnesota Valley Historical Society formed in 1895 with the goal of, quote, the preservation of the history of the Minnesota Valley, including the collection, preparation, arrangement, and publication of historical information, the marking of historic sites, and the commemoration of historic events associated with the Minnesota Valley. The principal accomplishment of the MVHS was the creation of a series of roadside historical markers and monuments marking sites in Redwood and Renville counties related to the US-Dakota War. Members of the society researched and sought to identify the specific locations of historic events. In their efforts, they consulted with Dakota and non-Dakota individuals with firsthand knowledge of the area and the war. The Society's historian, Return Holcomb, was tasked with collating this information. He also authored a very helpful pamphlet to our project that was published in 1902 that detailed the Society's accomplishments, the markers and monuments, and the effort that was made to accurately place them. In 1898, the Society's contractor placed 11 granite markers and 2 monuments at selected sites in the greater Redwood Falls and Morton area. I just want to say for a second, we distinguished markers, those things that were placed along roadsides marking a location, from monuments. There's 2 monuments that are these obelisks, like the one on the right that was placed at a burial location and the other one at the Redwood Ferry site. This map illustrates the distribution of the markers, including a cluster of 4 markers at the Birch Coulee battlefield and a grouping of 6 at the Lower Sioux Agency. Outlying markers were also placed at the homes of Taoyate Duta, Wapahasha, Camp Pope, and the Battle of Redwood Ferry. The following year, in 1899, the Society also sponsored the construction of the 52-foot-tall Faithful Indians Monument that was placed next to the state's Battle of Birch Coulee Monument atop the bluff above Morton. According to the Minnesota Valley Historical Society's self-published history, the granite blocks used for the markers were, quote, of sufficient size and strength as to be enduring and practically imperishable. And they were right. More than a century later, all of the markers and monuments created by the MVHS are still present. Unique for the era, the markers designed by the MVHS were placed along public roads where they could be read by people passing through the area. These roadside markers were placed on the very edge of the public right-of-way, and common to historic images like these are the strands of barbed wire fence line immediately behind them, denoting those limits. The inscriptions on the markers provided a distance and direction for the viewer to the point of interest. For example, 400 feet north stood Forbes Trading Post, August 18, 1862. Illustrating their creation in a pre-automobile era, 3 of the markers placed near farmstead entrances are also functional 3-step horse mounting blocks. The concept of offset roadside historical markers appears to have been initially conceived out of necessity by the Society's president, Charles D. Gilfillan, and subsequently adapted to the activities of the Minnesota Valley Historical Society. A businessman and politician, Gilfillan was not only the Society's president, but also its principal benefactor, and his sudden death in the December of 1902 led to the Society's end. During the last decade of his life, Gilfillan was increasingly involved in recognition of the historical events of the US-Dakota War, including serving as chair of the Birch Coulee Monument Committee in 1893. It is possible that Gilfillan's desire to mark US-Dakota War locations for posterity arose out of his experience on the Birch Coulee Committee. Of the 3 veterans of the battle that served on the committee, Gilfillan said, quote, "No 2 out of the 3 could agree on the exact spot on which the battle was fought. They were from 300 feet to half a mile apart on location." When the commission was unable to secure from the landowner a spot within the core of the battlefield, the state monument was erected on a site atop the Minnesota River Bluff on the fairgrounds of the Renville County Agricultural Society. The selection of a location miles removed from the battlefield sparked controversy, and the commission was taken to task in the press. The legislature actually passed some funding to move the monument back to the battlefield once the land was secured, but it was never enacted. In April of 1895, amidst the ongoing debate about whether the state's Birch Coulee Monument erected in 1894 should have been placed on the battlefield rather than atop the bluff, Charles Gilfillan was quoted in the New Ulm Review saying, "It was the intention of the commission to have a large stone placed further back from the hill and on it to have words engraved commemorating the battle having been fought there." And thus came about the roadside historic marker. On the north side of the Birch Coulee battlefield sits a large boulder monument perched on the edge of the right-of-way. Unable to place a monument on the site until the following year when the state purchased a portion of the battlefield, the commission, and most likely Gilfillan himself, opted to erect this marker in 1895. The necessity of offsetting the marker, due to the lack of access, resulted in the distance and direction format adopted by the Minnesota Valley Historical Society. While different in form than the upright tablets of the MVHS, it is clear that this marker, which is made of local redwood granite, served as the prototype of the roadside markers and monuments that Gilfillan's recently formed society would go on to place at other locations around Redwood and Redwood counties. The markers and monuments created by the MVHS are historically significant as examples of pre-automobile era roadside markers. The design of the markers and their inscriptions allowed the location of historic sites to be viewed from public right-of-way. This was a novel concept prior to 1900. Across the country, the roadside marking efforts of most states did not begin until the late 1920s, in consort with the growth of automobile ownership and the development of a network of roadways. The placement of historical markers was further spurred in the 1930s by the activities of the Works Progress Administration. Virginia's roadside historical marker program, which began in 1926, is often cited as one of the oldest in the nation, with noted earlier exceptions being Colorado's historical marker program developed in partnership with the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1907, as well as the work of the Pennsylvania and Indiana historical commissions, both 1915. The historical markers and monuments of the MVHS precede the earliest of these efforts by almost a decade. As a group, they are recommended as National Register eligible in the areas of transportation and social history. In addition to documenting the history of the markers and conducting a survey and assessment of their condition, one of the outcomes of the project was Two Pines' preparation of a signage and restoration plan that included recommendations for improving existing signage and interpretation of the Minnesota Valley Historical Society and these historically significant roadside markers. And that's actually a good place for me to stop and to hand off to Cheyanne, who's going to share her perspective on these markers and their historical interpretation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to take this time to explain and share Lower Sioux Indian community's experience as a partner in the project. Please know that the perspectives and the sentiment that I share do not represent all Dakota nations, elders, or citizens. Concern about the markers and the monuments has been an ongoing discussion and conversation in Lower Sioux for over a decade. One of the key pieces of work that I was particularly looking forward to being able to address was the interpretive rhetoric associated with these markers and being able to elevate a broader Dakota narrative in our area. We all had become accustomed to a fragmented and inaccurate narrative surrounding this era of history, and these early memorialization efforts fell short of representing the Dakota narrative and experience. Many of the markers, if they had any interpretation associated with them at all, proliferated a settler colonial victory and victimization. Before entering into my role as a Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, I served as the Lower Sioux Agency Site Manager for many years. I worked with an array of audiences from Minnesota and elsewhere, and many of them unaware of the markers and the monuments in the River Valley. But we did have some audiences that drove into the area specifically to visit them and asked how to access them. Curtis Dahlin's guidebook to the US-Dakota War of 1862 was one of the contemporary sources of information to understanding the US-Dakota War sites in the Minnesota River Valley. What I realized in both of these experiences as a site manager and being a access of resources was that these sorry, I lost my place here. These experiences were those that Minnesota audiences were very much interested in. They wanted to learn more about the markers and the monuments, and there were not enough informational resources available to the public to share more than just the location and a settler descendant version of historic interpretation. It was quite apparent in our area, the non-native community invested in markers and monuments that were associated with a specific era of history and with a specific narrative. And they were usually stories and narratives in which the Dakota weren't anything beyond brutal, hostile, and aggressive. So what you see there is a depiction or a photograph of the Milford Monument, which is just outside of the corridor from other monuments and markers that we had evaluated in Redwood and Renville counties. This one's actually in Brown County. And you can see that aesthetically, the landscape is very well taken care of, manicured. There's interpretive signage there. There is other memorialization efforts aside from just the monument and marker itself. We had a request from an elder to explore how our office at Lower Sioux could elevate these collection of markers and monuments through interpretation, through means of interpretation. There was a strong desire to elevate truth-telling and Dakota experience, but also showcase the inscription on the markers to let the insensitive language speak to the attitude and the portrayal of Indian people at this era in history. This is where the seed was planted at Lower Sioux and discussions started happening and partnerships were formed. And we continue to move forward with the project work. We know that we have Dakota stories in Lower Sioux, those of Wapahasha, Taoyate Duta, and others. We are their descendants and we carry that knowledge and these stories. This is how we will continue to contribute to enhancing the Dakota narrative in our area by elevating stories and sharing our language. It was important that we not only daylight these markers in the river valley, but make sure that they remain a point on the landscape where an inclusive history is shared. And Lower Sioux had many ways that that was going to happen. One of the more meaningful ways to address the historic rhetoric was to combat it with our sacred language. We would use our Dakota language to reinterpret and reclaim these areas, since many were inaccessible areas and locations where we could not yet include interpretive signs. For the community, signing with dual language and creating a centralized location where visitors could learn and access this information and education was imperative. We decided to, this interpretive sign, the centralized interpretive sign was placed on the northern bluff where the first attack of the US-Dakota War took place, Trunk Highway 19. It was an ideal location and overlooks the Redwood Ferry crossing, and there's also a memorial sign there already. So a little bit about the project. Our initial idea, or a part of the conversation, included creating a centralized interpretive plan or interpretive sign where visitors could access a compilation of information and background about the markers and the monuments. And so there was an initial location selected, and due to some barriers, we were not able to utilize that location. Second to that was the Redwood Ferry crossing location on Trunk Highway 19. And we had proposed to create this, is it 4x3? 4x3 interpretive sign that included a map that identified the location of the 15 markers and monuments in the river valley. Additional to that, we proposed to install an audio post that would allow visitors to access an Dakota language version of the interpretation. They would be able to access a cultural interpretation of history throughout the Minnesota River Valley from a Lower Sioux perspective, and then also history, culture, language. Yeah, history, culture, and language. Those are three options in which visitors could access a variety of content there. And this is a version of the historic roadside marker interpretive panel that was placed at that location. As mentioned before, the locations are identified on the map. What was really unique about this opportunity is the partnerships that we were able to leverage by getting this project, or through this project, specifically in the development of content and getting it funded. So Lower Sioux Tribal Historic Preservation Office holds a seat with the Scenic Byway Alliance, the Minnesota River Valley Scenic Byway Alliance. And so we partnered with them to get the sign created, and we were met with a lot of support and encouragement. And this 4x3 interpretive sign was installed recently in July on Trunk Highway 19 in Renville County. And so you can see the content kind of guides visitors to the background of the markers, and you got the map and a few examples of the monuments there in your lower left-hand corner. And this was the day that we kind of unveiled the sign. We were able to get stakeholders together for the installation of the sign, and then to do a group visit to the sign. We had spent well over 3 or 4 years having these discussions about what this interpretation was going to look like around these collections of monuments and markers. And so to finally get to the day where you have a tangible product in hand and see it represented on the landscape was a really exciting time for all of us. Teresa will share a little bit more about some of the procedural barriers and some of the procedural successes in having to do a project like this and get to the point where we were at in this photograph of unveiling the sign. I don't know if you can see it, but our little audio post is right down here, and it provided a series of options that visitors could, for ADA accessible reasons, could hear about history, culture, and language. And we worked within Lower Sioux. We consulted with Dakota language experts to get the translation for the interpretive content in the Dakota language and recorded for the audio post. We also worked with Dakota elders and descendants of both Wapahasha and Taoyate Duta to collect those stories for preservation purposes, and to also enhance the narrative that surrounds these collection of monuments and markers. In addition to the centralized interpretive sign, we also undertook a portion of the study to look at the highway signs that were in the county right-of-ways that were over the monuments and the markers. And so a lot of the signs, through that study, a lot of the signs were in need of replacement. They were faded, you couldn't see them. The highway kind of was an impediment to being able to have a full purview of what you were reading on the landscape. And so we went through the signs and the sign equipment, and tried to make the determination on which needed to be replaced and how that was going to look. So we had a series of these 1x8 brown signs that identified what the location of the place was. A lot of them were in the Redwood County right-of-way. As mentioned, a lot of them were worn and in need of replacement. What this opportunity allowed for us at Lower Sioux and with our other partners was to look at how we were going to reclaim these spaces. And as mentioned before, we decided to combat that with language. So reinterpreting these through the Dakota lens and having the presence of the language be one of the more prominent pieces that would be included on these signs. And so these are the locations, the markers, the locations, and the Dakota translations for what is being proposed as a replacement for those 1x8 signs. Michelle showed you in the slide deck earlier, the Taoyate Duta OT. That is a dual language sign that was located over the Little Crow marker in Redwood County. And we also have, Lower Sioux is now stewarding 7 of the signs in the Lower Sioux Agency corridor. We have one reclaimed in Redwood County, which is the Little Crow. So in addition to that dual language, we also have ownership of that monument and or that marker and signage well into the future. We created interpretive education for the DNR location, the Camp Pope one. So we work with that. We are working with that agency to create an interpretive sign and some education around that particular location. And then here is a mock-up of what those signs will look like once they are installed on the highway in their respective locations. And we have one that was just east of the Lower Sioux Agency corridor, kind of on this, in this outlier area. This is the Chief Wabasha Village site. And this is the current look of the sign and the area. And what we're proposing through that restoration plan is not just an enhancement of the signage, but to have the monument reset. In this previous one, you can see that the base of the monument is crumbling and it's kind of falling away from the physical marker. And so we hope to continue to work on this project by restoring and increasing accessibility for visitors to these locations. And I would like to take a moment to introduce Teresa. She's going to talk a little bit more about the process for us to get to where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheyanne. You know, you're getting old when you have backup cheaters. Thank God. So I just want to talk about a little bit about what, why MnDOT's involved in this. And obviously Trunk Highway 71, where the Little Crow marker was, is the state highway, trunk highway that's under our system. We got a call from one of the elders, or we got a permit request from one of the elders from Cheyenne's community asking to remove the Little Crow marker. They wanted to put it, she was thinking to put it into a museum. And we were like, okay, where do we start with this? We've got something in our right of way. It's a marker that was put there late in the 1800s. Who owns it? What is our responsibility as a property manager? And so we started to dig into this. The first thing was, who owns it? And I went to our chief counsel's office and then we ended up actually going to the AG's office to find out. And because the Minnesota Valley Historical Society was defunct, the object is considered an abandoned object. And if it's an abandoned object, people can actually petition to take possession of objects in the right of way. And usually they're things like, I don't know, an abandoned car or something like that, not usually a marker. So we were, okay, what can we do with this? And Cheyanne and Michelle and I had all worked on the County State Aid Highway 2 project that's in front of the Lower Sioux Agency Historic Site. Michelle worked on updating the National Register nomination for that site. So we had worked together as a team before. So I reached out to them and said, well, I got a project. It's a signing project. How tough can that be? If any of you have ever worked with signage, it's really, it's a mess. There's a lot to go into it, but I wanted to state, oh, I didn't change my, there we go. So the permit was to remove the sign. Who owns it? We determined it was an abandoned object. So the next step is to reach out to the tribal communities, the Dakota communities, and ask them what are their wishes on this. This is their history. It's all of our history. And the overwhelming response was to leave the marker there. So we saw an opportunity to partner and do something with this marker, shine the light on it. What can we do with these other markers that don't have stewards? Could it happen to them? It won't happen on the historic sites, but the Wabasha marker, what are some, Camp Hope is another one. And then how lucky would be too is that Cheyenne is a Wabasha, and we have a Wabasha marker too. So we have the family involved, not only just the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, but we have the family history too. So that was the start. And this was a project that really, the three of us decided we wanted to do. There wasn't really an undertaking other than there was the permit for it. So on July 13th, 2023, the new signage was installed after 5.5 years of planning. And that was in some part of that was because we were doing it when we could, and we had a passion for this and we wanted to get it done. It just took time. The funding took time to get into place. The permissions and the permitting and the testing and everything just took that amount of time. So when we're talking about, we don't want anybody to be discouraged if they're going to take on a project like this. Sometimes it just takes time. I guess as historians, we all know that it's history, but it came to fruition. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things, well, how important it was. We didn't do this alone. We really partnered up, and that was very important to this project. It's important because it can bring you money. It can bring you help. We're all so stretched for time. It brings better perspectives. It turned out to be a better project by involving our other partners. Did we go in it a little bit with our eyes closed? A little bit. There was a lot of challenges. I wanted to mention some of the things that to think about if you're considering some of these types of projects is that, will your project involve land? Who owns it? Who controls it? What permissions? There's all sorts of rules about right-of-way. There's, you want to make sure you're understanding the ADA considerations. Where is your pull-off? Can people see the sign? What's the access? Is it readability? What are alternative ways to share information? We really, focused on this voice box piece because the oral, having a Dakota speaker tell the story was just so much more powerful than reading. I've seen other things where people have put, for ADA, they put the story in Braille along railings. The QR code, you can think outside the QR code box, but that's another way of interpreting things without messing up landscapes if there's historic landscapes. Understand what the signage needs are and who you need to talk to about them. A colleague of mine from White Earth had seen these dual language signs and she's like, I'm going to make some of those. And she got some grants and she made these signs and put them in the right-of-ways, and they were taken down a week later because they were county right-of-way. And you just have to know where you're putting your sign, what the rules are. And we learned along the way. It was a slow process. We learned all these rules along the way. Also, you want to really think about who's going to own these, who's going to be the steward, who's going to maintain them, particularly if you're doing like a QR code, because you don't want that broken link. I've been to historic sites where you scan it and the link is broken, then you're not telling your story. There are other ways to do it. The electronic data the same way as you need to keep it current. And the nice thing about this tour-made voice box that we used is it has a removable, thank you, SD card. So Cheyanne can take it and they can record new stories. They can record new vocabulary words. As we learn more about the history, they can update the history. So these are things that can keep it current. And the Lower Sioux community is taking possession of the sign and the voice box, and they will be keeping it up to date. So identify who is going to be the person that's going to keep that up to date for you. What's the dollar? What's the dollar amount? Do you have a ballpark? We didn't really know how much things were going to cost, and we reached out to Holly Slagle. Some of you may know her. She runs our Scenic Byways program. That's a program that's embedded in MnDOT. It's a DOT program. There's well, I'll go into that a little bit later, but she helped us find funding that was tied to some Scenic Byways funding, that was tied to some non-traditional funding, that was tied to some of our state dollars. And so it was, it was a cobbling, but we got it figured out. It took a year to figure out, but we got the funding put together. And that's where, when we had a contract with Michelle to do some of that work, and we were able to also assess the impact to other historic properties if you want to do a project like this, make sure if you're going to put a sign in, it's not going to impact archaeology. It's not within another historic district. It's not in a landscape that's important that you want to put junk on. Just make sure you're thinking about the other historic resources that are in and around the area and how compatible it is. And then I guess I've made the point several times, but identify your potential partners. It's really important. It makes the coordination takes a longer period of time, but it provides a much better product in the end. That was our experience. I'm going to talk a little bit. I was going to mention too, just a couple little side things. That voice box, if any of you have been to the Bruce Vento Park in St. Paul, Marlena Miles has a display there. She's a Dakota artist. You scan the code and then the artwork like comes up. And remember when I first saw this technology, I thought, how does that artwork come out of the pond? And my sister's like, it's not in the pond, it's on your phone. I'm like, oh. I mean, it's a really cool interactive experience if you get a chance, but they had one of those voice boxes there, and it's solar powered. So they can go places where you don't have to have electricity too. And it's another reason we're going to move our voice box too, because it's a little bit in the shade. So that's another thing we learned. We also learned that the snowplow could take it out. So we have to move that too, because we didn't know. We went through all the ADA and then we realized one of the maintenance guys says, first time we get a heavy snowplow, it's going to come through that wayside and it's going to take your signs out. And we're like, ah. So just, thinking about, sometimes it's even talking to the maintenance people, particularly if you're doing ADA and things are lower and closer to the back of the curb, you might have issues. So, and also, the voice box, I have to tell a funny story. So we realized we had to put the sign up temporarily and the voice up temporarily. There was a land back celebration down at Lower Sioux. We wanted them up. We got them up. Then Cheyanne pressed the voice box and it started playing Hotel California. It happened to be the day after the guy from the Eagles passed away. And I'm sure they have a recording studio. They were probably listening to that, so we got the wrong SD into the voice box. So, and while Cheyanne is standing there visiting, one of the actors from Reservoir Dogs stopped by, right? And you were like, oh, I don't want him to press the button. So anyway, we still have a little bit of work to do, but we're going to get there. I wanted to talk a little bit about who our partners were, and obviously the heart and soul of the project was the Lower Sioux community, and in particular Cheyanne was the mover and shaker. They were doing some new interpretive signing at the, not the signs over the markers, but new interpretive signing for the historic site as well. And so she was in close contact with David Kelleher from the Minnesota Historical Society, working on that. And then Two Pines Resource Group, which we had worked closely with on the Lower Sioux Historic Site and National Register update, just a natural partner, excellent historian. And then Holly Slagle with Minnesota Scenic Byways and the Cultural Resources Unit at MnDOT. We worked with the Minnesota River Valley National Scenic Byway, which is a really robust byway. Christy Fernholtz was the person that we worked with there. The nice thing about working with the byways too, and I recommend, is that usually they have websites. You can upload your information, so the website's already there. You can tie into it. We've got, again, I'll go into the scenic byways a little bit later, but then MnDOT District 6, which is the MnDOT district down near Morton, they fabricated the dual language signing for us for the Little Crow site, and they also installed it. They helped us through the permitting process. They helped coordinate the Wayside Rest. They were really instrumental in getting the project done. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, we reached out to them because the Camp Hope marker is on their property, and they were great. They were really excited about an opportunity to work with the Lower Sioux community, and they're going to purchase their own sign. And the gentleman that we met with is continuing conversations with Cheyanne about doing some more reinterpretation in the valley. We met with Redwood County. You guys, this is why it took 5.5 years, but we met with Redwood County because some of the signs are in their right of way, and they kindly offered to install those signs for us. Then we also met with Redwood County Historical Society. That was Nicole Enziger, if anyone knows Nicole. She was great. She attended a meeting with us with Paxton Township because it turns out that the road on the other side of the marker is a township road. So we were working with, state roads and township roads as well. And then of course the Minnesota Historical Society, which helped fund, did they fund all of the new dual language signs at the historic site? Yeah. And also we really worked with them a lot to make sure that there was some sort of stewardship that although they informally did, we worked with them to formally recognize those monuments that are outside of the historic site property so that they are the stewards of it. They're in writing, they're the stewards. So this slide just shows a little bit of how it came down, who is taking stewardship, what the different land ownership was, the historical area, and then the different monuments that were on it. And this is what we were working with. So I did want to put Holly's contact up here, just as a promo for the scenic byways. The new funding cycle is coming up. The national program at one point was shut down nationally, but it's back up. MnDOT still maintained the state scenic byways. There's 11 scenic byways I think we have. But they have, they're a scrappy group and they're connected to funding. If you have ideas or you have projects that you're interested in, I would encourage you to reach out to the byway because they know where to find money. They know how to get projects done, and they're all volunteer too. So they're a good partner. And Holly can help direct you to those. There's a website, MnDOT website, that has a lot more information on that as well. So, all right, where are we now? We are, the dual language signage. Years ago, MnDOT formed this Advocacy Council for Tribal Transportation. It's been around for about 15 years, and I'm speaking, of course, from MnDOT from the transportation perspective, but it's representatives from the 11 tribal nations, or their transportation specialists. And we worked for about 10 years with FHWA to get them to change their rules about dual language signage on trunk highway systems. And it took a long time, but it worked. It did, it happened so that going into reservations, coming out of reservations, there's other instances when these dual languages can be used now on federal highways. And I would encourage you to this Dakota or Ojibwe dual language signage program. There's some information there that might be helpful to you if you're interested in doing some dual language signage with some of the indigenous communities in Minnesota. But at any rate, reach out to tribal government leadership if you want to include indigenous language, because they're going to be the ones that are going to say whether the language is appropriate, if the spelling is appropriate, is the use is appropriate. And this is really with any community, and I'm not telling any historians something that you don't already know, but in particular with these are some resources in particular to Dakota and Ojibwe communities. And down there on the right, that picture is some of the new signage at the Lower Sioux Historic Site that Cheyanne worked with. Cheyanne, who is all involved in that group that worked on that? Mostly MVHS? Okay, yeah, really, really nice work. If you haven't been down there to see the historic site for a while, there's been a lot of updates and a lot of new signage. It's really a great spot to visit, particularly this time of year. So, all right. So there's also some other resources that I just wanted to point out because I'm MnDOT and I work for Tribal Affairs. So there is a website, it's interactive with some lunch and learn YouTubes. with some indigenous speakers and on land rights, different resources there that are, they're good lunch and learn trainings that we've done that we taped and put them on YouTube. There's also a tribal business website. So if you are interested in working with tribal businesses, it has links and connections to those businesses. We encourage you to use them. It shows where they are in the state too, so that you can see where they are located geographically as well. I always give a plug for the Tribal State Relations Training, which is celebrating its 10th year this year. MnDOT runs that training. It's for Minnesota state employees only at this time. The governor, I guess, is looking for funding to try to bring that training out to counties and locals as well. It's the best training I've ever taken it as a state employee. But I encourage you, if you are a state employee, to see if you can sign up for it. I think that's all I had. Did I cover what I was going to cover? Okay. We were going to open it up for questions. And I'm going to let Michelle field those. She'll moderate. Okay. Thank you. Moderate if I can figure out how to get it out of here. First off, is there any questions from the audience? That's a very good question. And that's all part of the safety part of it. There's not very many instances on trunk highways that they allow that to happen because people are just going too fast and there's too much of a chance for accidents to happen. There can be exceptions. I would always ask. Trunk highways and state highways, the rules can be slightly different between those, but generally, if you're going to put something up, if it's an already established pull-off, which is what we did on 19, we actually have to put this, because of the snowplow thing, we have to put the sign back now, so we have to build an ADA ramp, but the district it's an ongoing project, but yes, that's a harder thing to do on a trunk highway, but reach out to what district are you in, or what area of Minnesota are you in? Yeah. Yeah, so there's a couple of ways we address that. So the first monument that brought this to our attention was the Taoyate Duta marker, which is on a trunk highway, very busy highway outside of Redwood. And it's literally in the ditch, and there's no way you could pull off on the highway. We were fortunate, as Teresa mentioned, there's sort of a township frontage road that backs on that ditch. And so in this case, we worked with the district. What we did is we signed the next intersection. So it says historic marker turn in a quarter mile. So we're not encouraging people to pull off on the side of the highway. We're encouraging them to take that next exit. And then the district also did not allow the sign to be signed towards the highway, because that could be I don't know, the technical term is a distraction. It's a distraction. Yeah. And also there had to be enough parking on the township. There had, yeah. At least one car. Yeah, so we had to have enough space for one car on the frontage road. And so when you go to the sign, it's not actually signed towards the highway. It's actually signed towards the frontage road to, again, encourage people to go behind it. The other monuments, the ones that are within the historic site, the ones on the Birch Coulee battlefield are on gravel roads, county roads, countryside type roads. The ones within the Lower Sioux Agency site are problematic in that at the time they were installed, the road and the markers were on the same grade.
But then when they improved the highway, it's now on a fill prism. And so the reason those brown signs were initially installed is because when you're driving by, you can't actually see the marker. So those brown signs sort of tell you, oh yeah, there's a historic marker down at the bottom of the grade. During the management of the Lower Sioux Agency site, now what they've done is they've mowed a path to those markers so that you can approach them from safety of the historic site. Anything else?
Yes, and you can see that, yeah, that's such a good question. I'm sorry, I wasn't tracking where I was thinking you were talking about your own project, but yes, and if you look at the sign on 71, it's slightly, but it's on the back slope, not on the front slope. And that's why we were able to also sign it. It's on the back slope, so it was out of the clear zone, for crash, even though it's crashed into at one time, but stuff does get crashed into even if it's on the back slope. But so there's there's rules around that as well. You bet.
Other questions, Becky?
I think from my office's perspective, we've been able to participate in both avenues of those funding opportunities, private and state, and even some federal. So we partner with, like, for example, we partnered with the Scenic Byway, and that was for legacy dollars to create that centralized interpretive panel and a series of itineraries to accompany it. We worked with Michelle on that as well. Yes, we've worked with universities through the Minnesota Humanities Center and their funding. So there are opportunities, and we do encourage partnerships at some point. If you are including Indigenous perspective, you have to be a partner with an Indigenous community to really, fortify what it is you're putting forth.
And there's been some fits and start with that as well, but there is much more of an interest to have that dual language. You've been signing, just put up the 1854 treaty boundary signs. So there's more. There's more. Yep. I'm not the sign person, so I apologize. But I would say yes. And in fact, 3 years ago, MnDOT formed its own unit, the Tribal Affairs Unit. It was part of government affairs, but now there's a staff and it's its own unit. It's it's emerging with and much more important than it has been in MnDOT in the past, and with FHWA as well for signing. I can speak to that. Did that answer your question? Okay. In the way back? Oh, in the sign.
The interpretive panel?
Oh. There's different, of course, there's not one answer. There's the one right here. I'll let you guys know. The interpretive panel is.
Yep, the interpretive panel was done through the partnering funds with the Scenic Byway, so that was legacy dollars. Oh, who created it? You, the Gopher Sign Company?
Yeah, that was actually through Scenic Byway dollars.
Yep, Scenic Byway dollars. And then the brown 1x8s were done through the Minnesota Historical Society. I'm not quite sure who they were.
And their sign, they do that. They make the highway signs. They had to buy them from us. Oh.
MHS bought them from MnDOT.
They had to buy them from us. Yeah. Those brown signs and such. So our sign shop made them, but I think the signs were like $370 a piece. And there's stuff like, it's not just the sign, you guys, you got to know, like, the poles and the breakaway and what kind of bolts and which ones. I mean, you'll learn more about signage than you ever wanted to know, but there's lots of rules around it. So.
Are there any, oh, straight. It would depend on the location and who the property owner is. So in this case, they were abandoned because MnDOT considered them to be abandoned within their right of way. But, so it'd be a question of the land ownership and who originally, I guess, created the marker or monument. In this case, we did, yeah, ownership. Some was ownership and some was stewardship. And then stewardship, yeah. That goes to private property laws and other issues. So it's kind of on a case by case basis. And that's what we found with these, is that each one of these markers had to be considered individually, and its history and who was the current landowner. The process of researching that. Also, this was not a monetary exchange for the stewardship of the monuments. It was an agreement on it. So there was no cost to the actual taking on the stewardship, just the agreement that in the future you will look after it.
Signs are replaced about every 10 years. I mean, depending on, oh, sorry. Signs go in a cycle. There's the recommendation for replacement about, I don't have the rules in front of me, but it's like every 10 years or something like that to make sure if it's reflectivity and, but the sign owner replaces the sign. So like MNHS, we fabricated the signs for them. They paid from, they were $370 or whatever they were. So the other little trick too is when you're getting your sign made, have it on both sides. So when one side wears out, you flip it over. I mean, like seriously, because it's a minimal cost to have it print, to have it extra print on the other side. And that way you're going to save yourself, and you can just flip it over and reattach it. But I think it's like a 10 to 20 year period when the signs start to fade. It's more important, right, for safety signs and maybe for interpretive signs, but that, yeah. And you were going to talk about the landowner, or how you did the private landowner, or did you want to mention anything about that, or the sign down? Yeah, and you were working with them and they were gonna.
Yeah, there was one of the monuments that was located on private land on the south side, or excuse me, the north side of the river. So in Renville County, and that private landowner happened to have a relationship, be a neighbor to myself. So I knew him from my my family. And so we got into discussions about when the study was underway, allowing Michelle and her team to have access to study that monument and marker. And we continue conversations about possibly his family trust providing us an easement through there so that the public can continue to access that location. It's directly north of our current historic site ferry crossing location. So right across the river is a private landowner. He has a trust, and he's looking at trying to create something with the tribe into the future, off of the trunk highway where the public can access that monument.
I saw another question. Yep.
I would begin with the leadership. Oftentimes, there may be projects that you feel like it should be within the purview of the Historic Preservation Office, but each of the governments are structured in different ways and have different capacities. So what you might think of, a preservation officer doing may not necessarily warrant them doing it. It could be a Dakota language expert. You could get directed to an intergenerational program. You could be directed to a roads department. It just depends on the project work. So always start with the leadership because they know their community best, they know their structure best, and they'll make sure that the appropriate departments and representatives get looped into that work. Yeah, I think a good place to start is just starting to build relationships. I mean, for people that are in Mankato here, extending a time with leadership or the community to do an informational presentation about your project, or maybe have a tribal day where you're inviting local tribal communities to your events or to your facility so they can get to know the faces that they may be working with into the future. But starting to form relationships before there's a need for a project, so that that work goes all the more smoother and it's a lot more enriching when it's genuine. So
Would you mind giving the example of the Miami tribe? It's such an instructive story. If you want, do you mind sharing that? Or
no,
thank you.
We had some questions that we were gonna maybe ask or bring up to the group, and one of them was, what are some things that didn't work so well, or other best practices? An example of how imperative it is to do outreach is, I had attended a summit last year in which Miami tribe TIPO office was explaining how their local, I believe it was their county, had named a steamboat after their tribe. They used the Miami language to name the steamboat. And then later on, they invited the Miami tribe to, have their elders and their community take a ride on this and do a photo opportunity. But when they actually came to the tribe, to the Miami tribe, it was interesting. Some education had to happen. The Miami tribe had shared a part of the history in which their people were forcibly removed by steamboats and these types of ships. And the county really thought that they were doing something that was meaningful and honoring history. But this is the interpretation that a lot of, indigenous people, there's that thread of trauma that is a part of our narratives, and you want to make sure that you're avoiding that, or that you at minimum understand what it is, and to only use the indigenous language when you have the permission of that community that it's coming from. So that was an example of maybe what not to do. Yep, they did eventually, by recommendation of the Miami tribe, is that they created some interpretation panels down at that boat landing. And so it talked about that history and talked about, the experience that the Miami tribe had. So it did end up turning into a wonderful opportunity for a lot of audiences in that area to be more informed and educated on the era and the event.
I think that's probably a great spot for us to end. I think one of the things we learned a lot about was to give yourself time. We kept talking about how long the project took, but it also got better over time. The more people we worked with and the more input we had. And the other thing is reach out early, right? Talk to those partners and make those connections early in your project so that you don't find out about the snowplow taking out your sign when it's too late. Thank you, everyone. And we're happy to take questions after too.